Hi, it's week 3 and it's all about self-compassion.
And rewiring the brain for happiness.
Some really interesting discussions this week about self-compassion, compassion for others. But the really tricky one seems to be around being compassionate to ourselves.
Somehow it can be much more challenging, can't it? A lot of our learners were pointing out that they notice they're much more critical of themselves than other people. They're often much kinder to others than they are to themselves. And some of the stuff we say to ourselves, Craig, let's face it, we would never say that to someone else.
No, imagine if you broadcast it or write it down. Not necessarily the most helpful. And I think the challenge is that ourself, and I guess we're talking about our ego, is so much closer to home. It's about the closest thing to home to us. And, and that always with mindfulness, you get that little bit of distance, that little bit of standing back, that little bit of non-attachment. It makes it easier to be aware and compassionate and objective and rational. And the closer something gets to home, the harder all of that is. We don't get the big view at all. We get a very sort of close-up view. And,
that's right.
And it makes it very hard to be self-aware and
which is where the mindfulness comes in, because we can step back from that. And of course, as with every mindfulness activity, the first step is to start noticing those self-critical thoughts going through the mind and just to stop feeding them.
Yeah.
Some of our learners as well wondering where that comes from. Is it something that's learned? Is it societal? And I would say probably it's a little bit of everything. We do learn how to relate to ourselves in our families of origin.
Yes.
Critical parents might make us a little bit more critical, for instance. And then, of course, society really values, you look at what's happening on TV and everyone's always being kind of a little bit sharp and sardonic and critical. And so it's just the sea that we're swimming in, really.
And now, of course, social media, reality television, everything else, which is often so far from reality, it's hard to fathom.
Gordon Ramsay in the kitchen.
And social media is a very, oftentimes a very artificial, removed way of interacting with others. And so for a lot of kids these days, they're brought up in an environment that's perhaps not really helping them to connect with themselves and to connect with others.
Which is why practicing compassion and self-compassion becomes so important.
Yeah. Also some interesting questions and comments about rewiring the brain for happiness.
Yep.
And what do we mean by that? Have we got to be happy all the time? It's like, and if we frown for a moment, I actually practiced some mindfulness in the dentist chair yesterday, so I hope you can tell me. But is it like having to be happy all the time? Or?
Well, it depends what we mean by happiness, right? And we're not, of course, in talking about that superficial happiness of putting on a smiling face for everybody and always looking for the positives. That's not necessarily mindfulness. What the mindfulness helps us to do is to notice, first of all, that we have a negativity bias. We get caught up in all kinds of negative or unhelpful thinking that creates unpleasant emotions for us, and to just step back from that. I mean, that's the first thing, so that we're not making ourselves so unhappy. But then, as we've been doing over the last week, we can start to cultivate things like compassion, gratitude, savouring, just by focusing on things that are pleasant or positive.
Because it'd be pretty true to say that we can certainly wire our brain for unhappiness, for rumination, self-criticism, anger, hostility, etc. So we can certainly unwire that and wire something else in. And I also think that we can actually be, say, sad and happy at the same time. But I don't mean happy in a Pollyanna kind of way, but happy in a way that we just feel connected. We feel like we're expressing an emotion in a way that we feel comfortable with. So paradoxically, I think we can actually be happy and sad at the same time. But it depends on what we think happiness is. And it's a very superficially used word very often. And that kind of superficial happiness, I think, can, as some authors have written, can be quite a trap.
Definitely. And I also like what the wisdom traditions have to say about this, which a lot of them will say that happiness is our natural state. And again, it's that much bigger happiness that comes out of being connected with ourselves and with others and focusing on what's useful and what's positive.
And kind of related to contentment. And ability to be content with or at peace with or equanimous in a situation, even though it's difficult.
That's right. And then we've got that hedonic happiness, which is getting our happiness from hedonism. You can think of hedonism from things and experiences. Nice things happen and we feel happy. Then you've got that eudaimonic happiness, which is much more about meaning. When we live a meaningful life, we just tend to be much happier. And that's a much more resilient type of happiness. So lots of different types of happiness.
That's right. And we could be making great sacrifices or enduring great difficulties, but if it's with a greater sense of meaning, really according to our deep values, and we'll be exploring more of this next week, then we bear it in a totally different way.
Yes.
There are a lot of questions as well about past and present and future, and wait a sec, mindfulness is about the present, but maybe perhaps some of it's been misunderstood, or maybe some of it not expressed very well. But when we talk about being present, mindfulness is very much about being in the present.
Yeah.
But in the present moment, we might be entertaining thoughts about the past, or living past stuff in our head now and out of touch with the present, or anticipating, worrying, living something before it's happened and experiencing the anxiety associated with that. But it's all happening in the present. But of course, the things that we experience now, the things that come up, our reactions and attitudes, are very often the product of what we've done again and again and again in the past. And here it is, bang, in the present moment. And it's in the present moment with that awareness. Oh, here it is again. Do I want to keep redoing, re-ingraining what I've been doing for a long time that hasn't been helpful?
So the noticing of that stuff happens in the present moment.
That's right.
Yeah.
And you get a chance to say, all right, well, I can keep going down that well-worn path of reactivity or whatever it might be, or I can practice something different.
Yep.
Being a little bit more patient, or stepping into a situation that I've been avoidant of, just practice stepping into it and learning to feel comfortable with the tension associated with doing that.
Yep.
But it all happens now.
Yes.
But if we make those conscious choices now, then things start to unfold differently as in the future when the future comes.
Yeah. And what's interesting about all of this is, as some of our learners noticed, it's not just about feeling happier and feeling better, but things like self-compassion actually have very big impacts on performance.
Yes, yeah. And, correct, because, and the way that intense self-criticism impairs our learning, because if something happens and we're intensely self-critical, judgmental, cruel on ourselves, that it makes it hard for us to stand back and be objective, to just look at it without distortion. Because very often when we're self-critical, we distort, make things look worse than they are, make ourselves look worse than it is. I mean, we might have made a mistake, but it's easier
blow it out of all proportion, don't we? And we think that's going to stop us making the mistake in the future. No. We just have to focus on it and beat ourselves up enough that we never make that mistake again. But I like your point that we lose perspective and we can't actually see clearly what's happened.
Yeah, and we don't learn from it. And the demotivating effect of that, and the negativity that we project into the future, is this going to happen again? Mm-hmm. And it just creates enormous anticipation and distraction. So paradoxically, the self-compassion is associated with being able to learn better, function better, not repeat errors, etc.
Yep. Yeah. And of course, we can practice that in each moment. If we notice ourselves being self-critical, self-judgmental, we can step out of that with mindfulness and perhaps start to deliberately cultivate a kinder attitude. And we can also practice that in the sitting meditations. And that's what a lot of our learners really appreciated this week. The notion of neuroplasticity, that any moment where we're cultivating an attitude of kindness or compassion for ourselves, we're literally rewiring the brain, laying down or strengthening circuits associated with friendliness and kindness and compassion. Yeah. And a lot of learners made some really great comments. Like they started to notice that when they were doing that, they were very surprised by the results. Some of them started to remember events from the past that were long forgotten. Mm-hmm. And some of our learners as well, were more able to sit with vulnerable feelings, those primary emotions that we'd normally react to. But that space of self-compassion helps us to stay really present with ourselves, and I think can really deepen our mindfulness practice as we learn to be more and more present with what's there.
It's a real paradox that just being able to make space for something, to just be with it, to just hold it in a kind of an affectionate awareness, actually helps us to process it. Yeah. Oftentimes for it to process itself more quickly than hour upon hour of rumination and criticism and thinking and overthinking something. It's quite a paradox, I think.
And that helps with stress, with unpleasant emotions, but also with physical pain.
Yeah, and the pain meditation, and mind you, emotional pain, physical pain, anything we find uncomfortable, is similar kind of principles in terms of learning to work with it. But yes, a lot of learners finding that very helpful, and it literally does change the way the brain processes things, and it enhances our capacity to choose what to engage our attention with and what to just let be there. And so fantastic to hear. A lot of learners have found that very helpful.
Beautiful.
A little philosophical question at the end there, Richard, about is a memory a thought, or is a thought, are they different?
Your memories and thoughts, are they the same? Well, look, I mean, by thoughts, we mean any time the mind wanders away from what's actually happening in the present and we start to think about the future or the past, we start to plan, worry, remember, dwell, or start to judge and react to what's happening here. So I would say that memories are one type of thought. Would you agree with that?
Oh, I think so. But mind you, if somebody had an MRI in your brain and when you go into memory mode about the past, well, there are probably slightly different areas of the brain that are active when you're planning and preparing something for the future.
Yes.
Or when you're analysing a mathematical problem, for example. Or when
language-based versus sort of... Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so certainly there are different kinds of thoughts, but from the perspective of we're talking about them, it's all just thinking.
Thoughts are thoughts, it's all thinking. We're either present or we're caught in thoughts, and we want to try to maybe step out of that as much as we can, or use it more skillfully, as you said.
Right. And Oh, well, I was going to say about 1 in 10,000 is worth giving attention to. If you can just let the other 9.
So our most popular thought or most popular post this week was on needing to be your own best friend, which I think is just a wonderful way to think about compassion and self-compassion, and how showing yourself compassion is really the foundation for being more compassionate to others, because how we relate to ourselves in the end really is how we relate to others. So I think that was a great comment. Yeah.
So another great week and fantastic, so many useful reflections, thoughts being shared on the forums. Tremendous, and thank you also to our mentors providing such great support. Yeah. And next week we're just going to deal with a couple of little things like the big picture and ethics and meaningful life. That shouldn't take us long.
Shouldn't take long. Yeah.